Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of SIPA Paranormal Chronicles. Today, after much technical issues, I'm glad to say I finally have Kate Rae. Kate, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, we have been trying. The fairies have not been on our side this evening.
They definitely haven't. It's taken us over an hour to log into this podcast. Someone's playing amok with us, but we're not quite sure who it is. So, Katie, if you can just tell us a little bit about yourself first before we get into the episode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I am I class myself as a paranormal investigator, researcher, writer, podcaster, and public speaker. I'm also a published author. I write for Haunted Magazine. I'm part of GPE, which is Ghost Finder Paranormal events, which I'm very proud to be part of that team, as it's International Paranormal Day today. So that's a top one. I'm jack of all trades, master of none, better than being master of one, I think is in a nutshell.
Perfect. So, how did you first get involved with the paranormal?
Oh, so this is a really potted, very quick history because it goes way back. I was chatting with my mum a couple of days ago, in fact, and she recounted that I'd had paranormal experiences when I was about 3 years old. And I think it was that age that it absolutely terrified me so much that I shut down from it and I didn't want anything to do with it. Fast forward, I'd always been interested in supernatural, anything weird, but I steered clear of ghosts. I had an insane phobia of poltergeist activity. Absolutely petrified me. And I decided on a certain significant birthday, I shan't tell you which one it was because I don't want to give my age away, being a lady and all that. On a
21.
21. Um,
Yeah.
I challenged myself to make a mark on that birthday. And I was discussing it with my brother and said, I want to do something significant. And he said, well, why don't you do something that scares you? You bungee jumping or swimming with sharks or, that kind of fear-based activity. And I just said, hey, can you see me bungee jumping? That doesn't even, it scares me, but it's not something I want to do. So he said, well, what really scares you? And I said, poltergeists. So we kind of sat there thinking about how we could do that. So I decided to go on a ghost hunt on my own with a team, but it was a weekend in a very haunted castle. And I went in there petrified and came out there feeling like a hero. I was a warrior of the paranormal after that weekend. So from there on in, the universe just literally gave me in bucket loads of opportunities. I joined within a couple of weeks a local ghost hunting team. And I started going on Barry Guy's events. I had a friend who was part of the team, and I'd been on 2, I think. And by the third one, he said, would you like to join the team? He threw me straight in at the deep end and asked me to hold a seance with 60 odd people in a very, very haunted location. And that is in a nutshell how I kind of got into it. I said to the universe, I'm open to this. I want to face this. And years later, it's become a massive part of my life.
And it's interesting that you say that because I noticed that there's 2 different teams. There's team I want to go out and get scared,
Mm-hmm.
or this team I want to investigate
Yes.
to see if it's all real. So, yeah, I can see where you're coming from on that because I can actually relate to what you've just said because a few years ago, I refused to watch any paranormal TV shows. I don't know what it was. I didn't have any previous inkling that there was anything out there. I just did not like watching them. But since over the last couple of years, and I've got involved with paranormal teams, I watch every single one of them. And then I go, yeah, that's not real. That's
Yeah.
not real. That's not real. So, how, like, for your very first investigation, what was going through your mind? And at what point did you realize that I'm no longer scared with this? I'm going to move forward and like take it all in.
Well, that weekend wasn't the very first investigation. I'll briefly tell you about the very first one that I went on, and I was duped into it, and it compounded my fear to a petrifying stage. I got a phone call from my cousin. It was probably about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. She said, "We're all booked on this event to go to a place ghost hunting." She'd just discovered she was pregnant and couldn't go because the insurance of the ghost hunting team didn't cover her pregnancy. Would I like to take her place? I didn't have anything to do, so stupidly said yes. And as we were driving to that location, I said, "So where are we going?" I had no idea. And I think it was Coventry Guild Hall. It was one of the famous guild halls. Now, I had in my mind, I had seen the photograph, very famous photograph of a lot of councillors, black and white, a lot of councillors sat round a massive table in a banqueting hall within a guild hall, and behind them is a very clear Knights Templar apparition. And
Wow.
when they said where we were going, I said, "Pull over. Nearest service station, pull over. I'm getting out." And they wouldn't. And I spent that night absolutely petrified, literally clinging on to anybody who was stood next to me. So fast forward to the one where I decided to face my fear. Similar thing happened. I pulled up. It was St Breville's Castle, which it's not a true castle. It's a place where I think armory was stored. So it's not a massive place. So I pulled up and I sat in the car park thinking, "Don't go in. Just don't do it, Kate. Just don't do it." And these two absolutely lovely ladies pulled up beside me in the car and rolled the window down and said, "Are you here for the investigation?" And I said, "Yes, I'm here for the investigation." And they said, "Have you got any alcohol?" And I said, "No, I haven't." And they're like, "Well, we have. We're not going." It was their first investigation as well. So we all felt like we were going in, team scared together. And the investigation, I think on the first night was fairly quiet, but heard stories. I was actually stopping in one of the bunk rooms that's called the hanging room. Now, each of the rooms has a certain tale to it in terms of ghostly activity. And the hanging room, one of the rumours is that people, I think, if I remember rightly, people get their hair tied to the bedstead in the middle of the night and see the apparition.
I'd have a problem with
I
that.
know.
Right.
So this is me on night one. I literally had I was the last person to bed, bizarrely enough, and I got into bed and I put a hat on, so nothing could touch my hair. I had earplugs in, so I couldn't hear anything, and I had an eye mask on, so I couldn't see anything. And I lay there like a wooden plank, totally awake for the entire night. And when you've lay in that kind of scared sense of things, you get so stiff the next morning. I was aching so badly. And the next day, I thought, "Sod this. I can't do this anymore." And suddenly, the evening after, I found my heroic side and just went for it and thought, this is what I'm here for. I can't have another night laying there like a plank of wood.
I I so have to come out on an investigation with you
Yeah.
because I think it's gonna be hilarious. So how did you transform from being that scared individual going to uh, investigations to getting your knowledge about the subject we want to talk about today, fairies?
Yeah. So the fairies, I'll put on the back burner for a minute because the fairies have always been in my life. This is predating the whole ghost hunting thing. So how that evolved was, like I said, I joined a very small local group of ghost hunters. I was gifted to go and be on the team with Barry Guy, and during that time, in a very intense period of time of about 2 years, I decided that if I was going to do this and it was being offered up by the universe, then I was going to learn everything I possibly could. in a very short space of time. So I would go out with other teams to get investigation knowledge. I did a parapsychology course up to a certain level. Any course that was coming up, whether it be mediumship, I went to spiritual circles. I literally went to anything that was connected. I went to see platform mediums to see how they worked, and just absorbed as much. I mean, you never stop learning in this game, do you? You never ever stop. But I would,
True.
a very short space of time, I was learning Kabbalah, I was learning all kinds of different spiritual pathways. I was really immersing myself in everything that I possibly could. And the two worlds collided, the fairy world and the ghost hunting world collided when I was doing mediumship training. Now, I am probably the world's shittest medium. I'm just, excuse my language, I am rubbish. I am rubbish. Um, but I thought I'll train. I'll give this a go. I must put a caveat on that. I'm a rubbish medium, but I was able to really skill up on my psychic ability. So the two are in slightly different quarters. And where other people, when they were developing their mediumship, were seeing spirits of the dead, and then I'll move them onto the light and all that jazz. I was seeing creatures, beings that were not human and were not of what I would deem a demonic, entity. They were definitely something other. Now, when I first really got into fairy lore, folklore, was probably my very, very early teens, late sort of childhood, early teens, and I was always disgruntled about children's books and children's TV portraying fairies. It didn't sit right with me. It looked wrong. It felt wrong. And I discovered the work of Brian Froud. And Brian and Wendy Froud both were concept artists on the Labyrinth and on the Dark Crystal movies. And Brian's work it was like a light bulb moment that somebody saw them in the same way that I did. That they were animistic, they were of the land, they were gnarly, they were humanoid to some extent, but something very, very different to the Tinkerbells that we'd seen. So as practicing mediumship, this is what I was seeing. This is what I was getting, and it eventually got me kicked out of my mediumship course because apparently I was frightening people. Because I was saying I was seeing these things, which it really devastated me at the time. Really devastated me at the time that I was asked to leave, because I felt like these things were more real to me than seeing the spirits of the dead, because they traverse in the world, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But it wasn't until I went on a very early investigation with Ghost Finder Paranormal Events, and we have the opportunity to go to some incredibly haunted spaces. And these are places that I've not been to before. So I would give them a psychic scan, if you like, and I would go into the building way before any guests turned up. And I could wander around the building, usually with a historian or somebody who knew the building, and see what I could pick up. And we're in this one particular building, and we'd gone up into the attic, and I psychically saw these three, probably about 4.5 foot beings, that were kind of had tufts of fur all over them, sort of big nose, and they were swinging like monkeys in the rafters. And they wouldn't go. And they were literally giving me images of the haunting activity that they were producing within the property, which I got verified from the historian. Now, I turned to my colleague at the time and he said, "Are you picking anything up?" And I said, "Yes." And I didn't want to tell him. And I told him I didn't want to tell him. And he said, "What are you seeing?" And I told him, describe what I'm seeing. And I said, "These are from the fairy realm." You can imagine the ridicule that I got. You can imagine the whole, this isn't real, and the whole piss take that took place, for months, I think, after. Fortunately, Barry took me very seriously. and was very interested in these other beings that fell into this fairy realm. And he's been incredibly supportive of my work, and also his increasing knowledge of these things often tie in with haunted properties and haunted activity. So that was the moment the two worlds collided, and from there on in, I'm used by the fairies. I became this advocate, if you like, for this slightly darker side of the fairy realm. That I can see them, I can interact. And when I say see them, I see them more on a psychic level. I can interact with them on a psychic level. And they use that to their advantage. You know, they want to tell their story and their side of things. Sounds crazy, doesn't it?
Yeah, because yeah, and like yeah, I've been speaking to you for about 20 minutes, and I now know you're crazy, but no, but seriously, like I'm the fact that you said a few minutes ago that you wanted to learn everything. I'm exactly the same. So in my group, I'm called the brains because I've done a demonology course, I've done a poltergeist course, and I'm actually teaching a course on paranormal equipment
Yes.
for the company that I started doing the courses with. So when I decided to do a podcast, you Google paranormal and it comes with so many different subsections. I thought, right, I want to cover everything. With so many podcasts, will just cover UFOs or will just cover ghosts or spirits. But I wanted people to learn about everything. Hence why you and I got in touch. Well, I got in touch with you and then you responded. But hey, and then this is how it's grown from then on in. So the fact that you can spiritually see these entities, for want of an easy word, was there a point though that you actually thought to yourself, "Am I normal?" Kind of, yeah. I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It's sort of like, yeah, do I need to go and see a doctor, kind of thing, or did it come more of a natural thing that you understood what it was straight away, and you knew that you wasn't going to come into any harm, or did you think there was something wrong with you, like mentally, for example?
I never questioned that, and the reason why I never questioned my own mental stability. Yes, I am mental, but in a good way. But I've never questioned that. I've never had a doubt about that, because the way that the images come to me and the snippets of verification that I get of what I'm seeing, when you're doing any kind of mediumship, when you're doing any kind of psychic work, the only blocker that you have is doubt. And when you start doubting yourself, you start putting logic into play. And when you start putting logic into play, you can't do it. You can't do the searching. It works on a different wavelength. Just before I got kicked out of my mediumship sessions, I was quite close friends with a lot of people in the circle. And at the end of one of the sessions, I had just finished writing an article that day for Haunted magazine about fairies and fairies in a haunted environment. And at the end of it, I'd done a section about how you can ward off fairies, how you can protect yourself, and how you can banish them. Now, that section, when I wrote it, I felt uneasy about it, but decided it was all part and parcel of what I was writing. So fast forward and standing outside a spiritual circle after the mediumship session, we were all stood in a circle, and there was a copse of trees behind, so a tree line behind me, and we were just chatting. It was dark. There was a light on just above us though, and we heard this almighty crashing sound coming through the woods, like somebody was running at full pelt. Now, this is going to sound crazy, absolutely crazy, but this is one of those verification moments that became more of a verification to me. The next thing I knew, I'd braced myself forward because I felt like somebody was going to jump on my back. And I felt like a bird had got stuck in my hair, so it was flapping about. And I bent down, and as I bent down, a load of soil came out of my mouth. Do you know how insane that sounds? How insane that sounds. If that had happened to me without several other witnesses, I would never tell that tale. Everybody around me, when I lifted my head up and I was still pulling soil from my mouth, I looked round, and this is probably one of the reasons why I got kicked out. Everybody looked petrified, absolutely petrified. They saw me spitting this, and they heard it, and they heard the wings beating on my head, and they saw me spitting this dirt. I just kind of went, I think I know what this is. So we all kind of dispersed. And as I was traveling home, I got a text message from two of them independently who are mediums and said, we saw psychically what jumped on you. And they described it, because they had a very Christian take on things. They described it as a demon. I knew it wasn't. Inherently, I absolutely knew this was a shot across the bows from the fairy realm saying, take that section out of the magazine. You know, you do not give those secrets away to people willy-nilly. I took that section out and I felt a lot better. Like you say, every time that story comes out of my mouth, I feel like I'm insane.
And yeah, it sounds completely like you're off your rocker.
Mm-hmm.
But this is the good thing that I like, because people have got so many different experiences, and like not everybody's like as nutty as a bag of frogs.
Mm-hmm.
We could probably mention a few that are, but rational people experiencing these kind of incidents. There's got to be more out there than what we know.
Mm-hmm.
and and that's what I love about like speaking to people like yourself, because I'm learning every time I do a podcast. I'm learning more and more and more
Yeah.
every single time, and to hear something like that is sort of like, I want to experience something like that, to say that what I want to believe in is real.
Yes.
So the stereotypical fairy that people know about, it's like you've already said, is the Tinkerbell fairy, wings little, about yay big. But there must be other types.
Yes.
Like people have heard like of changelings, have heard of elementals. So are they connected with the fairy world, or are they something different that's a different subject?
So for me, the easiest way to explain it is the word fairy means the others. So it's anybody or any being that's not within the realm of the dead or within the realm of the angelics or the demons. Now, changelings are swapped out babies. So the fairies would come along and swap human babies for usually lumps of wood, or for fairy babies who hadn't been born particularly well. Elementals is a tricky one. Everything to do with the fairies, there is tricky and sticky patches within the whole linguistics, terminology, and understanding. And that's one of the reasons why I love it, because it's quite a mercurial subject. Elementals has really gained traction within the paranormal community, and especially within TV shows. I've heard it on American TV shows, British TV shows, that people have referred to fairies as elementals. I understand why, because it's not, fairy isn't an easy word to accept because of its 20th and 21st century connotations. Elementals is easier because people think of spirits of the land. The word elementals is something that came way after fairy folklore and came with Paracelsus and the alchemists. So Paracelsus was, an alchemist, and he wanted to create these almost egregorial type characters that would take on the elements of earth, air, fire, and water to help within the process of alchemy. So within that, we get gnomes of the earth, we get sylphs of the air, we get salamanders of the fire, and we get the undines of the water. But that word has become synonymous with fairy, and some really hardcore fairy people, which sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? Hardcore fairy people. They won't entertain using the word elementals. They won't write the word elemental. They won't put it in the fairy realm. I put it in that realm just because it's become a collective name now, an acceptable collective name for fairies. So for me, under the umbrella of fairies, there is as many diversities as there is within the animal kingdom. So you have those beings that are as small as your thumb, maybe even smaller. You have light beings that are tiny light beings, right the way up to giants, dragons, trolls, huge, huge creatures, and everything in between. Now, the ones that I generally come across are animistic, humanoid, usually between probably 2.5 foot to 4 foot. Um, but I've known, because I run my own podcast and I talk to people who've had experiences, I've known people who have seen flying twig men, that look like humanoids made out of twigs with wings. I've had people who have had what we would consider as ghost hunters poltergeist activity, but they've said they've had a house brownie that's just gone rampant. So, the face of how people interpret what fairy is definitely changing from the Tinkerbell, which pleases me no end. Because a paranormal investigator, we need to have in our toolkit that we may be dealing with something other than spirits of the dead, and how we deal with these beings is very, very different.
Can you stop talking about stuff I've got no idea about? Because I'm really struggling to get some questions out now. it's sort of like, okay. So, so one thing that I've always wondered, and this is going really, really, really back to
Yes,
basics,
please do.
is you mentioned the word fairy. Yeah, you spell it Faire, but then you have the fae,
Yes.
and then you have fairies, Feiies. Is there any difference between that? And if there is a difference, why is it spelt differently?
So the old spelling, one of the old spellings is the Faerie or Y at the end, and Fae is just a shortening of fairy in that old spelling.
Okay.
Fairy with an I is the same thing. However, there is a definite shift away from, for those who are serious about studying it, away from spelling with an I, because of the link to Tinkerbell, because of the link to the Industrial Revolution, diminutive, sexualized, fluttery little butterfly being, and take a more serious look in from a folklore perspective or from an encounters perspective. And the way I see it is, fairy spelt with an I lives up in the sky. So it's your butterfly beings. Fairy with an E is everything. So if you see that E as everything encompassing, that's just my take on it. I just think that spelling it with an E gives it more grounding within folklore, more grounding with pagan connections and ancestral connections. That's the basics of it.
That explains it perfectly, and now I'm more knowledgeable than what I was 5 minutes ago.
Good.
So, so one thing that's also interesting, if you start googling, fairies, you kind of get pointed in the direction of Cornish fairies, which could be deemed Cornish pixies, and then you've got Welsh fairies, and then you've got Irish fairies that could be, leprechauns. So, is there a more populous location, Cornwall, Wales, Ireland, so to speak, or England, come to that, than what there is like internationally, or are there cultures for every kind of variety?
I think yes and yes, which is the short answer. I think England's a very interesting, an interesting view on fairies, because there are pockets of rural Britain, Ireland, Wales, Scotland, that have really retained their connection and their connection with the folklore and with fairy folk, and will still ritualistically do things. For instance, putting out milk and honey to appease the fairy folk. Globally, it's an interesting one. I've often spoken to different people about this. Globally, there is lots of similarities all around the globe with these beings. Lots of similarities, and we often talk. Is it just a case of, the the pixies down in Cornwall, are they the same as the redcaps that live in the Scottish borders? It's just that colloquially they've got a different name, and culturally they have different roles. Because we have a whole subsection. When you look at folklore, we have this bulk of a subsection which are little men who usually look quite wizened, usually wear kind of very earthy tone clothing, and they can either do you great harm, or they can do you good. And there are all those similarities. Or is it that these things are cousins to each other, and they've kind of split off and lived in different areas and become different, their race has developed differently? Or there could be no connection at all, that they are just self-developed within those areas globally. But it is very interesting. I mean, we definitely see connections in this country with those people who came to this country. You've got your Vikings and your Normans, and whoever else kind of rafted into the UK, and they brought their cultural demigods, if you like, the little gods, the hearth gods with them, which are often tied in with the whole fairy folklore story. And it's believed that that may be one of the origins of understanding of fairies, that they were house demigods that would look after the hearth or look after the cattle, or and would be called upon for different favours. It's I mean, that in itself is a huge subject.
Yeah, because and that, yeah, I'm finding it absolutely like amazing and interesting. So I've got questions in front of me, but I'm like, okay, I need to. You've kind of answered a little part of that, so I'm going to try and twist it. So one thing that I do find that if you do Google fairies, it comes across with if you communicate with them, you must do it in a particular way. You've already mentioned about leaving food out and stuff. So that also brings to mind the story in the UK back before both of us were born, of the children that encountered the fairies. That's really popular with the fairy pictures, but on their deathbed they actually said that it was
Hmm.
fake. Now, do you think that was 100% fake, or do you think there was something in it that started off small but then it was blown completely out of proportion?
I recently wrote an op for Dr. Simon Young about the Cottingley fairies. And for the life of me, the girl's name, it was Elsa, and somebody else has completely evaded me. So this is my feelings, and it's my personal feelings on it. I believe that there was something that they encountered. They always stood by the fact that there were fairies that they encountered down at the brook, and they wanted the world to believe. They were desperate for the world to believe them, because they wanted people to believe in this beautiful thing that they'd found. I remember, I don't know whether it's a false memory that I saw it live, or whether it was something that was recorded, but I remember being on the youngest girl being on telly, obviously a very elderly lady, and saying it was they were faked. Now there's two psychological things going off here. So it could have been that they said it was faked because they wanted to safeguard the fairies. They didn't want people to go finding them, because they felt a duty of care for the fairies. So they said, no, that's it. They're all faked. Or it could have been that they were faked. But both girls stood by completely that the last photo that was taken was a true photo. And they both stood by that. I think that there was something in it. I don't think the amount of publicity and those who got involved with it would have happened if there wasn't authenticity within that case.
And it's interesting that you say that, because I've done research on some very highly mentioned paranormal activity within the UK. Borley Rectory,
Mhm,
for an example. There was some initial paranormal
mhm,
activity, but then there was some fakery in it
yes,
to make it bigger than what it is.
mhm,
The Enfield haunting. there's reports that some of it was genuine and some of it was faked again.
Mm-hmm.
So I do find that, I don't know if these people just want the publicity
Mm-hmm.
and thinking, I'm getting all these reporters coming down. This is great. I want to keep this on, and then try to, if the real stuff has kind of faded away a little bit, they try and bring fake stuff into the world just to try to boost what's already there. So it's interesting that we mentioned that particular fairy story. But it's a shame that people have to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, come out with what you've seen. If you want to report it, do. If you don't want to report it, keep it to yourself. Yeah, and then move forward from there. But it's a big shame that people don't just keep focused on what's happened rather than I need to make this bigger than what it actually is.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I think it was slightly different with the girls at Cottingley. I think that there was definitely a sense of excitement. They were excited because they were being given cameras. They were having very esteemed people coming to visit them. But these were things that were fairly short-lived. It wasn't reams of people, rafts of people polling up. Of course, the children, they're going to love the attention. Of course, that there's that aspect. But I genuinely, in my heart, believe that they encountered something in that first summer, if not continued to encounter. And then I hope in my heart that that last photograph was a genuine photograph.
That's it, and unfortunately, in this day and age, so many things can be doctored,
Yes.
which puts our world to shame.
Yeah.
Because some people will go out there. So when you talk about fairies, everybody mentions fairy circles, and most people probably don't know what they are. So, can you give me your interpretation on what a fairy circle is?
Are we talking about one of my second favourite subjects of mushrooms by any chance?
We might be.
Okay, so I actually found out something really, really interesting that I'll tack onto this. So, in terms of fairy circles, one of the theories is that when you get a perfect circle of mushrooms popping up, it's usually in an open space that you can see it. I have actually seen fairy circles that they've got to have been 50 meters wide, and they were trooping trumpet mushrooms, and these things were huge, and I spotted those in the woods. Let me tell you, I will often jump in them hoping that I will get portaled away to fairyland. I will do that. So the theory is that wherever these perfect circles appear, and it doesn't have to be a specific mushroom, but the aesthetics of it is usually the fly agaric, which is the quintessential red or white. It's said that the fairies had danced in that space the night before, and with them doing so, that they create a portal to take them back to fairyland. And if you stand in them, you'll be transported away to fairyland. One snippet of information that has come out fairly recently over the last couple of years, and it'll come to me, the guy's name. He's very well known for he's kind of like the guru of all mushrooms. He's a doctor, somebody. It'll come to me. He was saying that they've recently found out that mushrooms respond highly to bass notes. So people drumming in a circle will stimulate the mycelia, the network under the fruiting mushroom. And often when those people have utilised that space for drumming or dancing or singing, within a couple of days, mushrooms will pop up within that vicinity. And they don't know why. It's highly stimulated by this really deep bass note of dancing feet. So I wonder whether this idea of fairies dancing and creating circles has maybe come from a pagan past, where people have been celebrating, dancing maybe around a fire or just in circles, because it's a very ancient thing to do, is to dance in circles. And then they wake up from their stupor of the night before of drinking, probably ghastly homebrew and whatever else, and they suddenly see these circles, these circles of mushrooms, which would have been mind-blowingly magical, that they'd been there dancing at that very same spot, and there they go. So that would have developed this idea that after they'd stopped dancing, the fairies started dancing, and they magically popped up these mushrooms. That's the kind of pseudoscience part of it. But I will always stand in a fairy ring and sort of challenge them and say, come on, then take me away.
And if that happened, you'd be going, okay, now what happens?
Exactly. Now what do I do?
Yeah, yeah. So, are you familiar with the term the Green Man?
Yes.
Okay, so one of my colleagues, Volta, I asked him to create me a couple of questions because he's got like a bit of a spiritual mind. I'm going to ask him two. I'm going to ask you two questions that have come straight from Volta.
Okay.
The first one: how does your belief in fairies connect with older nature-based traditions like the Green Man of European folklore?
Oh, well, you see, this is another one of my favourite subjects. I grew up next to Sherwood Forest, so the Green Man I hold very dear because there's obviously that connection with Robin Hood, the crossovers. The Green Man goes into that. The Green Man is also, in my mind, Cernunnos, is also Pan. So it's that wild god energy, that fertility god energy, and of course it plays into the whole fairy spectrum, and very much of that fairy energy and mentality. I was recently doing a talk, and I said to the audience, why do we think that fairies have become so utterly popular right now? Again, there's a resurgence in fairies, and working with fairies, fairy meditation, etc. And we got, we thrashed around some ideas, and I have a theory. We in this country alone spend billions of pounds on therapies, whether it's yoga, whether it's going out and taking ayahuasca, whether it's sit down therapies, whether it's whatever it is, medications and therapies for two reasons. One's anxiety and one's depression. They're usually the staple of why people go for these therapies. Now, if you think about it in terms of depression is looking behind you, anxiety is looking in front of you. So depression is milling around things that have gone off in your past and you can't change. Anxiety is a future fold thing, a worry about what's going to be in the future. The fairies live in the now. Whatever they do in the now, and it's gone. It's gone. They will often carry with them retribution for humans, but that's it. They don't suffer anxiety. They don't suffer depression. And for me, when you're talking about the Green Man, he's very much in the now. He very much lives in the moment. He is of nature. He is of what's around him in his surroundings, and protecting that nature. But he has more, I think, of a human connection than a lot of the fairies do. He kind of cross over because he is that god, that old god, and the fairies respect him.
And it's funny that you mention it being a god because one of his other questions, he loves the Green Man for some bizarre reason. Is it? Do you see him as a fairy king, an elemental guardian, or a spiritual archetype? And how does his presence influence your connection to the land?
So
So, like, where's he coming out with these
that's
questions?
brilliant. So for the first, the answer is yes. I see him as all those things. I see him as, he could have been human, he could be God, he could be an elemental, he could be a, 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 a whole holistic nature spirit. I think he's all of those things, and I think that this is the world of the fairy, that they can be all of those things all of the time, and it's how we receive and interpret them. Sorry, what was the second part of that question?
I don't know. I forgot myself. Uh, um, yeah. How does his presence influence your connection to the land?
Now that on a personal level, I don't tend to work with the Green Man. Um, Simply because I know he's there and doing his job, and I'm quite happy with that. Um, I think in terms, when I think of him in terms of fairies, I possibly think more Cernunnos, and I think don't mess, just don't mess. You have to listen to your gut instinct. Now, if I'd have listened to my gut instinct when I was writing that article and not left that section in at the end about the fairies, I don't think I would have encountered what I encountered. And what I encountered felt like Cernunnos energy. It was very powerful. It was very raw. It was very from the land and the earth. So I don't mess, and I listen. I listen.
And sort of like, yeah, when I see this guy tonight at this investigation, I'm going to go like, these questions, I can't even say half the words. So, so one of that kind of brings me nicely onto the next point, where yeah, are there any rules or guidelines for humans interacting with fairies, or if a human does think that they're going to be interacting with any kind of entity that they may think is fairy, yeah, is it a point of yes, go ahead and make contact, or should you generally avoid interacting?
So my golden rule is when anybody asks me that question is don't. Unless you are very clear about what you're dealing with, what you're asking of, how to sever that relationship, what that relationship's for, you have to be very specific with boundaries. One of the traits that all fairies have is the trickster element. So you may think you are. I'm blessed. I know a lot of lovely, genuine people who work with fairy energy, and I have played devil's advocate on time and said, you know, so you're working with fairy. Who are you working with? Oh, well, I'm working with the fairies. No, no, no. Who are you working with? Because then I liken it to if you go to your front door with a bottle of gin and you throw open your front door and you shout out that front door, does anybody want a drink? You have no idea who's going to come through that door or what their agenda is going to be or, what the atmosphere is going to be from doing that. You have to be very, very specific. And you have to understand that there is always payment, always. No matter what deal's struck, there is always payment for your interaction. Now, in terms of if there are paranormal investigators that are going out and they are coming across these kind of beings, I think the best advice that I can give is you are not there to banish, you are there to work with. Finding out why they're there is the first port of call, opening up a dialogue of communication. But it's also respecting that they're not there for no reason. They are definitely there for a particular reason. Now, in terms of going into a property and moving the spirits of the dead on or banishing and exorcising demons, they're very prescriptive things to do. With fairies, it's like those kind of tactics don't work at all. And I've always found that reason and rationale and communication have been the perfect starting point for these beings.
I could talk to you all day about this. I really could. So we're coming close to the end. So I've got a couple of, I think, really good questions,
Good.
but you might probably tell me different. With you bearing in mind what you just said about the interaction, if you are going to go out with the intent, like this is you personally, not all these crazy people that listen. If you go out and with your intention of trying to connect
hmm
with the fairy realm, do you do any spiritual practices or protections before you go out, or do you do anything after you've finished?
I used to do. I don't anymore. So I was definitely of the ilk of my pockets clanked with crystals. I had all kinds of anointing oils that I would put on. I would, bubble myself up, etc., etc. And I've come to the conclusion after years and years of doing this that the best form of protection is understanding and knowing I have a divine right to be on this planet and a divine right to be on this planet undisturbed. And knowing that has been enough, and it's really helped with a smoother connection. I will only connect in with these beings if I am asked to help in a situation that's become tricky for somebody who's living. So if a house is haunted and they suspect that it's not the spirits of the dead, they suspect that it's something more, I'll be asked to do a remote view on that property. So I will connect in with the energy of the property to see if I can scan and see what's there. I have only ever twice come across beings that haven't been interactive with me in that situation. And the majority of the time, these other beings are very surprised that somebody of the human realm can see them on a psychic level. That's number one. And number two, they are usually quite excited to communicate anyway, because a lot of the time they are there with purpose. And it's usually because humans have wronged them in some capacity. So, no, I don't do any protection. I don't feel like, because I feel like I've become an advocate for that realm and that particularly darker side of the realm, and I use that very tentatively, that word. I don't feel like I'm under any threat unless I step out of line. So I don't step out of line. I doff my cap, if you like, wherever I can
Yeah.
and say, yeah, I'm going to do what you say.
So, with that being said, people talk about having attachments from the paranormal spiritual world. Is it possible and does it happen for you to get attachments from the fairy world as well?
Oh, yes, definitely. Definitely. I think properties and people can get those attachments, and some of them really quite malevolent and destructive. And again, it's a very different way of dealing with them, because they're very rarely there with, like I say, without cause or without meaning.
Okay. So, final question of the day. Well, it's not a question, it's more of a statement. You've mentioned your podcast. You've got a few books out, so it's now time to plug yourself.
Oh, bless you.
So please feel free to mention your podcast and your books that you've written and where they can get them from.
So the podcast is Hair in the Hawthorn. That's on YouTube, and we talk about fairies under a 14 umbrella. So it's everything that's kind of connected either loosely or generally to fairies, and where the crossovers are between ufology, hauntology, that kind of thing. I have written a book, and I've got it here. It's the Woolly Snots, and that was about a particular case that took place in Nottingham in 1979, where a group of children encountered 60 gnomes in hovering cars. So that's about that. I've also written for the Fairy Investigation Society under Dr. Simon Young. Several of his books have got my essays in. What else? Forward for Lionel Fanthorpe for one of his latest books. So Reverend Lionel Fanthorpe, who is one of the paranormal world's great godfathers. I'm blank. I've gone blank. And go out and buy, if you can get a copy, go out and buy Haunted magazine, because that is just a spot on magazine when it comes to all things paranormal.
And that is where I kind of got your name from. It's sort of like, because that is my go-to, because I subscribe to it and it's like, that's an interesting subject, right? That person's name, and then stalk them. Contact them on social media. So, and that's how I've reached out to quite a few people. But Kate, I could speak to you all day, and let's do it because
Yes,
this connection was sucky to start off with. But you've got so many other subjects that I'd like you to talk about. So the invite is out there to come back on with a better connection, and then we can talk about something else.
I'd love to.
But in the meantime, awesome. In the meantime, I thank you for your time, and the listeners can look forward to hearing from something else from you in the near future. Thanks very much. You
Thanks,
take
Kate.
care now. Okay, bye bye.